A tourist hurled hot tea at a royal guard, expecting him to stay frozen, just another statue in uniform. But the moment the guard made a single move, everything shifted. The crowd gasped, and the tourist's smug laughter vanished in an instant. Here's what happened next. Before we continue, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe. Tomorrow at this same time, we'll bring you another powerful story of courage and discipline from the royal guards that you won't want to miss. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace, where tourists gathered in clusters, cameras clicking and children pointing at the imposing figure standing perfectly still. Guard Thomas Wells had been at his post for exactly 2 hours and 14 minutes, his scarlet tunic pristine, his bearskin hat casting a shadow over eyes that had seen more than most men twice his age. The weight of his rifle felt familiar against his shoulder, a comfort he'd grown accustomed to during long nights in places where standing still meant the difference between life and death. Among the crowd, a young man named Ryan Mitchell strutted, with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences. At 22, he was the kind of person who measured his worth in likes and shares, whose greatest accomplishment was a viral TikTok of him pranking strangers. His friends followed behind like eager disciples, phones already recording, anticipating whatever stunt their leader had planned next. They'd traveled from Manchester specifically for this moment. Ryan, having boasted for weeks about his plan to break one of these famous guards, Ryan approached the tea cart positioned near the palace gates, where an elderly woman sold steaming cups to shivering tourists. The irony wasn't lost on him, using Britain's most beloved beverage as a weapon against one of its most sacred traditions. He ordered the hottest tea available, extra sugar, claiming he needed the energy for sightseeing. The vendor, Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, had been serving tea at this spot for 15 years. She'd seen countless tourists come and go, witnessed proposals, celebrations, and quiet moments of reverence. Something about this young man's demeanor made her uneasy, but she handed him the cup with a polite smile nonetheless. Wells noticed the young man approaching before anyone else did. Years of military training had honed his peripheral vision to detect threats from impossible angles. He'd learned in Afghanistan that danger rarely announced itself with fanfare, usually came disguised as something ordinary, something you'd dismiss until it was too late. But his duty was to remain motionless, to embody the unwavering strength of the crown, regardless of what approached. His breathing remained steady, his posture unchanged, even as every instinct screamed at him to assess the potential threat. Ryan's friends positioned themselves strategically, creating a semicircle that would capture the perfect angle for their video. Social media had taught them the importance of good cinematography, even for acts of stupidity. They whispered encouragement, daring Ryan to go through with it, their phones streaming live to followers eager for entertainment. The crowd around them began to take notice, sensing something was about to happen. Parents pulled their children closer, instinctively recognizing the shift in atmosphere that preceded chaos. The tea was nearly boiling when Ryan lifted it high, his voice carrying across the courtyard with mockery that cut through the morning air. "Bet this guy's never moved a muscle in his life. Watch this." The words hung in the air for a moment, heavy with malice and ignorance. Then he flung the scalding liquid with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never understood the weight of respect or the price of honor. The tea struck Wells' chest with a splash that sent steam rising from his scarlet tunic. The liquid was hot enough to burn through fabric, to sear skin, to make any normal person cry out in pain and surprise. But Wells didn't flinch, not a blink, not a twitch. Not even the slightest tightening around his eyes betrayed the agony that must have been spreading across his chest. He stood as still as marble, as immovable as the very foundations of the palace behind him. The crowd's collective gasp created a moment of perfect silence, broken only by the sound of tea dripping from Wells' medals onto the stone below. Ryan's laughter felt obscene in that silence, his friends joining in with the nervous energy of people who knew they'd crossed the line but were too invested to retreat. They were recording everything, documenting their own stupidity with the dedication of filmmakers creating their masterpiece. Among the tourists, reactions varied wildly. Some looked horrified, others angry. A few seemed almost entertained by the unexpected drama. Children stared in confusion while their parents struggled to explain what they'd just witnessed. The contrast was stark: a young man celebrating his cruelty while a soldier absorbed it, with the dignity of someone who'd faced far worse in defense of people. who would never know his name. An elderly man wearing a veteran's pin pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with a rage that seemed to burn from somewhere deep in his chest. Harold Pemberton had served in the Falklands, had buried friends who'd died protecting the very values this boy was mocking. He'd spent 40 years watching society slowly forget the cost of freedom, but this was beyond forgetfulness. This was deliberate disrespect of the highest order. "You ignorant little boy." Pemberton's voice boomed across the courtyard with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "That statue has more honor in his pinky than you'll ever have." The words carried the weight of experience, of sacrifice, of understanding what it meant to stand for something greater than yourself. Ryan rolled his eyes with the dismissive arrogance of youth, turning to his friends for validation. They provided it eagerly, their laughter becoming more forced as the crowd's mood shifted against them. But something had changed in the air around Wells. A subtle tension, like the moment before lightning strikes, when every molecule seems to hold its breath. Then Wells moved, just his head, just slightly, but the motion was so unexpected, so precisely controlled, that it silenced every voice in the courtyard. It wasn't the reflexive movement of someone breaking character, it was the deliberate action of a predator choosing to reveal itself. His eyes, previously focused on some distant point beyond the crowd, now locked onto Ryan with an intensity that seemed to strip away every layer of pretense and bravado. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Even Ryan's friends stopped recording, suddenly aware that they were no longer documenting a prank, but witnessing something far more serious. The tourists stepped back instinctively, creating space around the confrontation, as if sensing they were about to witness something that would change them. When Wells finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, carrying the weight of authority earned through blood and sacrifice, rather than inherited through birth or bought through privilege. "This uniform," he paused, letting the words settle. "It's not a costume, it's a shroud, for the men who never came home." The words hit Ryan like a physical blow. For the first time since arriving at the palace, his smirk faltered. Something in Wells' tone, in the complete absence of anger or theatrics, made Ryan realize he'd stepped into something far beyond his understanding. This wasn't a game anymore, had never been a game. Wells began unbuttoning his tunic with deliberate slowness, each button a small revelation. The crowd watched in fascination and growing horror as the scarlet wool fell away to reveal a torso crisscrossed with scars. Some were neat surgical lines, others jagged tears that spoke of shrapnel and desperate field medicine. The most prominent ran from his left collarbone to his right hip, a savage diagonal that looked like it had nearly split him in half. "Got this in Helmand," Wells said, his finger tracing the longest scar with the casual familiarity of someone who'd lived with it for years. "IED took out our convoy. My sergeant was trapped under burning metal. Private Williams had his leg nearly severed by debris. I carried them both through a minefield to the extraction point. They lived. I got this, and the privilege of wearing this." He tapped his bearskin hat, and for the first time, Ryan understood what privilege actually meant. It wasn't about wealth or connections or the freedom to mock others without consequences. It was about earning the right to represent something greater than yourself, to stand motionless in honor of those who could no longer stand at all. The veteran, Pemberton, stepped closer, his own shirt pulling tight across scars that matched Wells' story. 3 years in Helmand myself, he said quietly. Lost my best mate to an IED outside Sangin. These boys. He gestured to Wells, his voice thick with emotion. They don't stand here because they have to. They stand here because men like us choose to honor the ones who can't. Ryan's world was collapsing around him. The prank that had seemed so clever, so harmless in his imagination, was revealing itself as an assault on something sacred. His friends were backing away, their phones forgotten, suddenly desperate to distance themselves from what they'd helped create. The crowd that had initially seemed amused or indifferent was now looking at Ryan with a mixture of disgust and pity. Mrs. Hartwell, the tea vendor, pushed through the crowd with tears streaming down her cheeks. "My grandson served in Afghanistan," she said, her voice shaking with fury. "He was 19 when he died, protecting people like you. How dare you? How dare you mock what he died for?" The circle of accusation was tightening around Ryan, each voice adding weight to his growing realization that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The internet's promise of consequence-free entertainment was revealing itself as a live reaction had a reaction. Every choice carried weight. Every moment of cruelty created ripples that spread far beyond the initial impact. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Someone in the crowd had called them, probably several someones. Judging by the number of phones that had switched from recording Ryan's prank to recording his comeuppance, the boy who'd arrived seeking fame was about to achieve it in ways he'd never imagined. Wells rebuttoned his tunic with the same deliberate precision he'd used to remove it, each button restoring a layer of the dignity Ryan had tried to strip away. But something had changed in the guardsman's posture. The revelation of his scars, the sharing of his story, had created a connection with the crowd that transformed him from symbol to human being. He was no longer just a tourist attraction. He was Thomas Wells, veteran of Afghanistan, survivor of hell, guardian of memory. Constable Margaret Davies arrived first, her patrol car screeching to a halt outside the palace gates. She'd been a police officer for 12 years and had seen every variety of human stupidity. But something about this call had struck her as particularly heinous. Assaulting a royal guard wasn't just disturbing the peace, it was attacking the very foundations of British identity. Right then, she said, surveying the scene with professional efficiency, "Who's responsible for this?" The crowd parted like the Red Sea, leaving Ryan exposed and isolated. His friends had melted away into the crowd, their loyalty extending only as far as their own self-preservation. The boy who'd surrounded himself with followers discovered that leadership meant standing alone when consequences arrived. Ryan's bravado finally crumbled completely. Faced with an actual police officer rather than a silent guardian, confronted by real consequences rather than imagined entertainment, he seemed to shrink into himself. "It was just a joke," he mumbled, the words sounding pathetic even to his own ears. A joke? Constable Davies's eyebrows rose in disbelief. "Assaulting a member of Her Majesty's forces carries a maximum sentence of 5 years imprisonment. Let's see how funny you find that." She produced handcuffs with practiced efficiency, the metallic click echoing across the courtyard like a period at the end of a sentence. As the handcuffs closed around Ryan's wrists, his phone still recording his livestream clattered to the ground. The screen showed his social media feed exploding with comments, but they weren't the celebratory emojis he'd expected. "Disgusting. Lock him up. Absolute disgrace." The internet's judgment was swift and merciless, his moment of fame transforming into a public shaming that would follow him far longer than any prison sentence. The crowd began to disperse as police cordoned off the area, but many lingered, reluctant to leave the scene of such unexpected drama. Children asked their parents difficult questions about honor and sacrifice, about why some people chose to hurt others and why some people chose to protect them. The adults struggled with answers, trying to explain concepts that seemed increasingly foreign in a world that celebrated controversy over character. Wells remained at his post throughout the arrest, his duty unchanged by the chaos that had erupted around him. But something was different now. The crowd looked at him with new understanding, their previous casual interest replaced by genuine respect. A little girl, perhaps 6 years old, approached with her mother's permission and placed a small bouquet of flowers at the base of his post. She whispered thank you in a voice so soft only he could hear, then scampered back to safety. The veteran, Pemberton, lingered longest of all. He stood at attention himself, offering Wells the salute of one soldier to another. "Carry on, son," he said simply, but the words carried the weight of approval from someone who understood the cost of duty. Wells' slight nod in return was the first acknowledgement he'd made all day, a moment of human connection that transcended rank and protocol. Mrs. Hartwell approached with another cup of tea, this one prepared with the reverence of a communion. "Offering for you, dear," she said, setting it carefully within reach. "Properly made, the way my grandson liked it." Wells accepted it with a gratitude that needed no words, understanding that this wasn't just tea but an offering of forgiveness, a gesture of healing after the morning's violence. The news crews arrived as Ryan was being loaded into the police van, their cameras capturing his walk of shame for evening broadcasts that would make him infamous across the nation. The boy who'd craved attention had achieved it, but in ways that would haunt him far longer than any viral video could have satisfied him. His parents would see this on the news, his future employers would find it in background checks, his children would someday discover their father's moment of supreme stupidity preserved forever in digital amber. Detective Inspector James Crawford took charge of the scene, his experienced eye taking in the details that would matter in court. The tea stains on Wells' uniform, the witness statements from outraged tourists, the crystal-clear video evidence that Ryan's own friends had helpfully provided. This would be one of the easiest cases of his career, but something about it bothered him, the sheer pointlessness of it all, the casual cruelty that seemed to define his generation's relationship with the world. Statement from the victim, Crawford asked Wells, but the guardsman shook his head almost imperceptibly. He wouldn't break protocol, wouldn't abandon his post, even to pursue justice for himself. His duty was to stand, to represent, to embody the values that Ryan had tried to mock. Speaking out of turn would give the boys' actions more power than they deserved. Pemberton stepped forward instead. "I'll give you a statement," he said firmly. "What I witnessed here today was an assault on everything decent people hold sacred. That boy doesn't just need prison, he needs education about what these uniforms represent, what these men sacrifice for people like him." The crowd began to share their own stories, each person suddenly eager to explain why the morning's events had affected them so deeply. A teacher spoke about trying to instill respect in children who'd been raised on a diet of viral cruelty. A mother described her son's deployment to Syria and her daily fear that he might not return. An immigrant talked about the safety he'd found under the protection of soldiers like Wells, the freedom to raise his children without fear of war or oppression. 1 month later, Ryan Mitchell found himself pushing a wheelchair down the sterile corridors of St. Bartholomew's Veterans Hospital, his community service assignment feeling more like penance with each passing day. The man in the wheelchair, Sergeant Peter Morrison, had lost both legs to an IED in the same region where Wells had earned his scars. Morrison didn't speak much during their daily walks, but his silence carried a weight that was gradually crushing Ryan's remaining defenses. The hospital was filled with broken bodies and unbroken spirits, men and women who'd sacrificed pieces of themselves for people who would never know their names. Ryan had initially approached his community service with the same casual attitude he'd brought to everything else, viewing it as an inconvenience to be endured rather than a lesson to be learned. But daily exposure to real sacrifice was slowly burning away his cynicism, revealing something that might eventually become wisdom. Harold Pemberton, the veteran from the palace, had made himself a regular visitor to the hospital, partly to check on Ryan's progress and partly to spend time with men who understood his own struggles with civilian life. He watched Ryan's transformation with the patience of someone who understood that real change happens slowly, one conversation at a time. "T-boys learning," Pemberton remarked to Morrison as they watched Ryan struggling to help an amputee veteran reach a book from a high shelf. The task should have been simple, but Ryan's complete lack of experience with physical limitations was making him clumsy and frustrated. Morrison chuckled, a sound like gravel in a cement mixer. "Takes time. I wanted to kill every civilian for the first year after I got back. Had to learn they weren't the enemy, just ignorant." Ryan overheard the exchange, and for once, didn't bristle at being discussed in the third person. He was beginning to understand that he'd earned his status as a cautionary tale, that his reputation was something that would have to be rebuilt, one small action at a time. The veterans didn't hate him, that would have been easier to bear. Instead, they pitied him, and their pity was forcing him to see himself through their eyes. Meanwhile, at Buckingham Palace, Thomas Wells had returned to his post, with a new understanding of what his presence meant to people. The incident with Ryan had stripped away the anonymity that had previously protected him, making him a symbol, not just of duty but of dignity under attack. Tourists approached him differently now, with more respect, more awareness of the person beneath the uniform. A steady stream of visitors had begun leaving, small tokens at his post, flowers from grateful citizens, letters from school children learning about service, photographs of family members who'd served in distant wars. Wells couldn't acknowledge them during his duty hours, but their presence reminded him that his sacrifice was seen and valued by people who understood its cost. The little girl who'd first offered him flowers after Ryan's arrest had become a regular visitor with her mother. She would arrive precisely at 2 p.m. each day, leave a single flower, and whisper a different thank you message. Today's was for her great-grandfather, who died at Normandy. Yesterday's had been for her uncle in the Navy. Her mother explained that the big ritual was helping her daughter understand the connection between past sacrifices and present freedoms. Mrs. Hartwell had relocated her tea cart to be closer to Wells' post, claiming better foot traffic, but really wanting to keep an eye on the guardsman who'd shown such grace under pressure. She'd begun preparing a special cup each day, the same blend her grandson had preferred, offered with the solemnity of a daily remembrance. Wells had never accepted refreshment while on duty before, but something about her offering transcended regulation. It was communion, not consumption. The media attention had eventually died down, as it always did, but the story had lodged itself in the national consciousness. Wells had unknowingly become a symbol of resilience in an age of manufactured outrage, a reminder that some things were worth defending with dignity rather than responding to with anger. His refusal to break character, to abandon his post for revenge or recognition, had demonstrated a kind of strength that resonated with people hungry for examples of genuine character. As the sun set over Buckingham Palace on this anniversary of the tea incident, Wells prepared to be relieved by the next guard. His day was ending, but his duty continued through his replacement, part of an unbroken chain of service stretching back through centuries of British military tradition. He'd learned that morning that Ryan's community service had been extended not as additional punishment, but at the young man's own request. Apparently, the boy was finally beginning to understand what service actually meant. A final visitor approached, as Wells prepared to step down, a young soldier in dress uniform, newly assigned to the palace guard. The boy looked nervous, overwhelmed by the weight of tradition he was about to join. Wells caught his eye and offered something he'd never given before, while on duty, the slightest nod of encouragement. One guardian to another, the new guard took his position as Wells stepped away, the changing of the guard as seamless and eternal as the tide. But tonight, Wells carried with him the knowledge that his service had been witnessed, that his sacrifice had been understood, and that somewhere in London, a foolish young man was learning the difference between attention and respect, between viral fame and lasting honor. The lesson, bitter as hot tea flung in anger, had steeped properly at last. And like all the best lessons, its effects would last far longer than the momentary pain that delivered it. In the end, that was worth standing still for, the chance that someone, somewhere, might learn what it really meant to serve something greater than themselves.